You're listening to the Options Insider Radio Network. For more quality options programs, visit www.theoptionsinsider.com or search for Options Insider Radio Network in your podcast provider of choice. Listeners can also access all of our programming through our mobile app, available in iTunes and on Google Play.
Please welcome to the stage Stacey Cunningham, Chief Operating Officer, NYSE.
Hi, I just want to echo some of Ivan's comments and thank everyone for coming and participating to make the conference a success. Our next panel has a slightly different day-to-day activity than we do. We spend most of our time navigating the financial markets and the evolution of the options industry. They spend their time navigating Washington, D.C. So slightly different. I'd like to, but where our worlds intersect is a really interesting time for us, especially given everything happening right now. So our next moderator is Julie Bauer, Senior Vice President of Government Relations at OCC, and Julie is going to guide the panel through discussion of current regulatory and legislative proposals and how they might impact the listed options industry. So please join me in welcoming Julie and the panel.
Well, hello, good afternoon. Thanks for being here today. I have a great panel to talk to you today. Between us, I have calculated the years we've been in Washington, but I promised I wouldn't reveal it. So some of us longer than others. I won't implicate myself. But it's I think all of us have been in D.C. for a while doing government relations type work, and I think it's fair to say that this year is perhaps one of the most interesting years we've observed. And like many of you, I'm sure, we follow things sort of day to day and see what happens in the morning and what we learn about. But let me quickly introduce everybody. First here on my left is Lita Frazier. She's the head of government relations for Chicago Board of Options Exchange, and she formerly ran government relations for the Chicago Mercantile Exchange as well. Hope Jarkowski, who is co-head of government relations at ICE, New York Stock Exchange, and she's had stints at NASD, the SEC, and the Senate Banking Committee prior to this, so she has witnessed things from the regulatory and the legislative perspective firsthand. And at the end of the panel there is Jeff Strunk, who spent 8 years on Capitol Hill, including serving as deputy floor director for former Speaker John Boehner. So he also has an interesting up-close perspective to Congress and how it operates and how the leadership works with its members to move forward pieces of legislation and organize the caucus. So I thought we would start off a little bit today talking about the transition that we've just experienced and are still experiencing a little bit with the new president. And one of the big jobs that any new president undertakes is organizing the federal government and appointing new leaders to agency posts. And over 500 of those jobs require confirmation by the Senate. So that's pretty significant lift. And there's been, in the past few years, a rule change in the Senate, and you probably hear it referred to as the nuclear option. It was designed to make confirmations easier to get through the Senate. But still yet, President Trump's nominees are being vetted and confirmed at a slower pace than was enjoyed by President Obama or President Bush before him. So, Lita, let's start with you. And can you talk a little bit about the process and the dynamics in the Senate that sort of lead to this situation?
Sure. So let's take a look at the numbers first. There's this nonpartisan nonprofit research group. They research government effectiveness. They're called the Partnership for Public Service. And they actually have reported that there's actually 1,200.
Oh, 1,200?
1,200 positions that need Senate confirmation, but out of the 1,200, there's 556 key presidential nominations. So if we use that 556 as a baseline, and we look at Trump's first 100 days as of last week, he has to date 27 confirmed and 41 still pending in the Senate. And if we look at past administrations, Obama at this point had 69 confirmed, President Clinton had 49 confirmed, and even President Bush had 35 confirmed. That's 10 more than President Trump has. There's no doubt that Trump is way behind in the process, but I do think, to his defense, he has taken a more private sector approach to, do we really need all these positions? Mm-hmm. But I think there are several reasons for the slow pace. I think, it's no secret that political tensions are extremely high, and immediately right after the election, the Democratic base went berserk over President Trump's win. And that put pressure, I think, on Democratic elected senators to, slow walk his nominations. Right. And just a side note, next year, a third of the Senate is up for re-election. That's 33 senators, but 23 of them are Democrats. So they have a lot more to lose. Another reason is, the Senate's been busy. They besides the nominations, they had to deal with Trump's first Supreme Court nominee. And that's when you mentioned the word nuclear option. That, in fact, it finally led to the Senate Republicans, deploying that nuclear option and getting Gorsuch through with a simple majority. Another reason is this administration, unlike past administrations, has not worked closely. They've sort of disassociated themselves with the Office of Government Ethics, and that office did a lot of the pre-clearing, or they would look for potential conflicts of interest with candidates, and they basically pre-vetted the candidates before they were actually announced. One last one is, some say, Trump came at this, he didn't really expect to win, and so he wasn't quite prepared with people ready in the queue, and he actually, he's nominated mostly from the private sector, no one with government experience, and I've heard that even some Republicans were uncomfortable with individuals that he chose for an agency, that he tapped for an agency that they really didn't have experience in. So,
right, just a different approach overall.
Yeah, that's my opinion.
Yeah, well, it's interesting too, because as you go from sort of Supreme Court being the most visible, probably nomination, down the chain, you do get to the independent agencies, like the SEC and the CFTC, that those in this industry deal with on a regular basis. And those are typically designed to function as commissions with 5 commissioners. Majority, 3 will be the party of the president, and 2 typically the other party. You do get some independents in there, so that kind of tips the scale a little bit. But right now, during the transition, both of those agencies have been operating until just last week with 2 commissioners. So how do commission vacancies, Hope, you spent some time at the SEC, how does that affect the ability of the agencies to function? And particularly, I know, interesting with only 2, you get some rules and restrictions on even conversations. So why don't you tell the crowd about that a little bit?
Sure. So I can take the agencies in turn, if it's helpful. The SEC until last week had 2 commissioners, Acting Chairman Pivovar and Democratic Commissioner Kara Stein. There's some sort of obscure quorum requirements and the rules of practice at the SEC that can be used as weapons should a commissioner, usually of the minority party, trying to prevent the majority from moving forward with an initiative. But thankfully that was not invoked over the past 4 months when Acting Chairman Pivovar was in place. He was, I would say, an exceptionally active chairman or acting chairman. He put forth 2 specific requests for comment on public company rulemakings that came out of Dodd-Frank. And he also was able to push for T+2 settlement cycle reporting with Commissioner Stein. So that's a lot to have accomplished as an acting chairman.
It is.
Now, Chairman Clayton is in the office. He was sworn in by Justice Kennedy last week, and he reported for duty on Friday. So he and some of his senior staff are starting to take shape. He gave his first set of public remarks today at the Small Business Advisory Board. So he's off, hit the ground running. And I think that there's been enough lead-up time and a lot of good conversations with Chairman Pivovar during his acting period that he's really going to be able to hit the ground running. They already have a very good partnership in place. So I think the SEC is on a good path. They still have 2 nominations, a Republican and a Democrat, that need to be filled. There were nominations during the Obama administration that never were confirmed by the Senate, and you had both a Republican and a Democrat languishing for over 18 months. It remains unclear whether those same individuals are going to be renominated, because at this point their nomination has expired. And so that remains unclear. It's probably going to take some time. On the CFTC side, they've had 2 commissioners for quite a long time, far longer than 4 months. And acting chairman John Carlo has been formally renominated, so he's an exception, by President Trump. He will probably be confirmed, I would suspect, in the next few months, and then they still have 3 commissioners to fill, 2 Republicans and a Democrat.
And so let's pivot from that for just a second. I do want to come back to Clayton, but Jeff, let's talk about whether we would see in all of this sort of reorganization or staffing up, do you think we'll see real significant change for some of the regulatory agencies? I know that there's been a lot of talk about restructuring the CFPB, for instance, or getting rid of it, or making it a commission, or putting some sort of programs in place to increase direct congressional oversight. This is something that's picked up in choice. The FSOC has obviously gotten a lot of criticism from the Republican side because of determinations they've made on systemically important qualifications. And so I just wonder how, now that there's a Republican administration, Republican House and Senate, do you think there will be significant changes to some of these regulatory bodies?
I think, unfortunately, there will not be, but it's not because of a lack of desire by the administration or by the Republicans in Congress, but there is procedural issues that they will have, and that is the 60-vote threshold in the Senate. So anything that requires outside of reconciliation for health care and then potentially tax reform requires a 60-vote threshold, and it's very hard seeing 8 Democrats coming over to assist the Republicans in making those reforms. Senator Shelby has tried to put them under the CFPB under appropriations so they could have control, but again, that's 60 votes as well. So I think that just because of the procedural notion, it's going to be very difficult, and a lot of that relief may have to come from administration.
So before we move on to the next topic, let's just circle back to Clayton really quickly. Lita and Hope, whoever wants to address this, but what do you think about him in terms of what his priorities might be, what he might pick up first out of the box, his areas of strength or interests that you know of at this point?
So I think his immediate focus, will be on capital formation and how to make it more attractive for companies to access the public capital markets. Do you agree?
I do. Yeah, I mean, he said as much at his Senate confirmation hearing. He's a transactional lawyer, Sullivan and Cromwell, kind of the cream of the crop with respect to deal making, legal advisory work. And so he's going to have a real appreciation of the needs of the public company. I would surmise, given his background, that he'll also appreciate not just the regulatory regime for disclosure and things like Sarbanes-Oxley compliance, but also the needs of issuer from the market structure perspective, the need for ample liquidity, low volatility. And so I think that we're going to see somebody who sort of gets the whole picture. Plus, don't forget, he'll be sitting next to Commissioner Pivovar, who has a PhD in equity market microstructure. So if I'm Chairman Clayton, I'm probably going to be relying on my fellow commissioner quite a bit to help sort of shape the agenda. But I agree with Lita. I think it is going to be a focus on capital formation type of issues. Starting out of the gate.
I think it's also good to note he has no political background whatsoever. So it's nice. That's a change in Washington.
And at the SEC.
Yeah.
It's been the most political commission I can recall for.
Yes, and that's something we've seen over the past several years, right, is more politically inclined people being placed in these roles. So it's sort of interesting to see a shift in the selection of some of those people and what that might bring to the table. Very interesting. All right, Jeff, a couple for you. Since the Republicans are controlling the Congress and the administration, I think a lot of people thought legislative and regulatory changes would come very quickly. And Congress did start right away using the Congressional Review Act. They've used the budget process to revisit some policies from the Obama era. And one of the questions I think some people have is, why do you need these procedural tools? Why can't you just do it? And talk a little bit about the dynamics that lead to that.
Well, I think that that was certainly the notion, especially for the White House. I don't think they realized how tough these things are to change. And part of that is because they don't want the government was set up for things not to happen quickly. And it's for exact things like this last election where you now have, majority party rules, and the House is a simple majority to move through, so the majority party can pretty much always work its will. But in the Senate, you have this 60 vote threshold, as I mentioned earlier. So one of those tools that they do have is the Congressional Review Act. It came around under President Clinton and Speaker Gingrich, and it's a way to look back 60 legislative days, so not calendar days, but days that they're in session, for rules that were put in place during that time. Congress can then go back and only have to have a simple majority in the Senate to basically get rid of those rules. So they did a series of them. The last one was just yesterday, and it was the first one that failed. It was unrelated to the industry. And now that window is closed. So they'll have to look at other different ways to roll back these rules. And that'll happen going forward. In some cases, they can be via the appropriations process. But I think that now that you have a Republican administration, many of those things, I think, will not be as needed as they were in the past as far as using procedural tools.
And tell us a little bit, since you had a bird's eye view working in the leadership, tell us a little bit about how the Speaker and his leadership team decide what to bring to the floor when. How do they know if they're getting their votes that they need? How are those decisions made? I know you could probably talk all day about it, but give us, a little glimpse of that.
Well, it's a moving target, especially these days. I think that part of that is they try to bring this kind of a bottom up in some ways to kind of get the compass of their membership. I mean, obviously the big ticket items are pretty clear of the things they want to accomplish. Healthcare, tax reform, infrastructure. But then there's also the things that they have to do. That's fund the government, raise the debt ceiling. There's certain things that need to be authorized. So I think at first look at what the calendar is for each one of those items, and you prioritize when you want to move them. As far as getting the votes, it's become more and more challenging. I think that on the last panel, Mr. Donahue and Mr. Reed spoke a little bit about earmarks. That was, John Boehner, and my boss at the time, got rid of earmarks. It has made the process a little bit more difficult because right now, instead of providing something they can immediately take home, like some sort of project and say, look what I got for you, they don't have that tools anymore. Yeah. So now there has to be substantive policy changes have to be made to bills in order to get them across the finish line. So it's made it a lot more challenging, a lot more labor intensive. And I think part of it is, I hope John Boehner doesn't see this. It's probably part of the problem might slow down a bit is because of the lack of wins they can have at home. So there is a movement to bring them back. I think it was touched on. I think that the process before was certainly flawed. There was some abuse that occurred in there. And I think that bringing them back in a different fashion could help, grease the wheels a little bit. But we'll see how that plays out. I think it's maybe a fourth quarter item of this year. But in general, a lot of this prioritized by the calendar and what are the things that they need to get done, and then start working around the edges on everything else and what member priorities are in each committee.
And just picking up on your point about earmarks, so back years ago when that was the sort of law of the land, there were different, those served as carrots and sticks, obviously. It was a way to generate votes that you needed in the caucus to move certain things forward. I think it's pretty interesting now because you have a lot of different caucuses within the Republican Party, you have different caucuses within the Democratic Party. There's not a lot of unity really on either side. How do you go about getting the votes? Does the leadership now go interact with each of these caucuses and try to find areas of compromise and agreement? How do you kind of get over that threshold?
The problem is that the candy store's open. There's not a lot of candy in the store. They don't have a lot to offer these guys.
Nothing there.
And so, and also within the, we're talking about, the congressman talked a little bit about the funding agreement they just had, and part of that was, some of the abuse that the president received from the right about this isn't a conservative bill. The problem with that is that because you have the far right, the Freedom Caucus, who's about 35 members that are very hard to get to vote for pretty much anything. And then if you start going to them, then you have the guys in the middle. They're called the Tuesday group. I'd say they're not the more moderate, they're the more pragmatic members. And the Tuesday group, we saw this on healthcare, they've been walking the plank for the last 6 years and on all these bills. And during the healthcare bill, they just said we're just not going to do it anymore.
Meaning they're voting?
They're voting in favor to move the agenda forward as the guys on the right get to just vote no.
Good.
And, kind of shield themselves from all of this. Because we do have to govern, and that's just part of the dynamic. So I thought the healthcare thing was really interesting as to how you saw this give and take going back and forth between the two, because every time you moved a little bit this way, you lost over here. And finally, a senior member, and a lot of this has to be member driven. There's only so much that the leadership can do to, consistently pound on these guys, because everything is circular. So even though votes on the healthcare seem totally different from votes on an appropriations bill, if you are making these guys walk a plank over here, it's much harder to make them do it again. So kind of find that dynamic, and the way that happened on healthcare was ended up being driven by former Chairman Upton, who's a moderate member, and he came up with an amendment that he thought could get enough votes, and that's how they got it to the finish line. So it's a combination of leadership pushing, but every time you get to a certain point, and the members had to figure it out themselves, and that's what happened on the healthcare bill.
All right, well, let's transition now to everyone's favorite topic, tax reform. I know we heard a lot from Congressman Reed today about it, which was great. And can you expand at all on what he told us today about what's happening, the administration, the House, the Senate? I think that when a lot of us read articles about it, it's focused on, usually the administration or the House, not so much the Senate yet, a little bit. But maybe, Jeff, get us started on this one. And
Sure. So, as the Congressman kind of alluded to, the House is significantly farther along in the process. Part of that was because all the work they did on the camp draft, although the blueprint is significantly different, but they did a lot of that hard work beforehand on that. And two, this was part of, if you remember during the election, there was this friction between Speaker Ryan and then nominee Trump, and had these endorsements, kind of like soap opera and all this stuff. So what Ryan wanted to do is he wanted to put out an agenda that Republicans could run on, House Republicans could run on, that if needed to could differentiate themselves from Trump. Well, they're kind of like, and they call it the Better Way agenda. That's where the House blueprint for tax reform was part of that. But they're kind of like the dog that caught the car and then it's turned into a real possibility. But what it was just bullet points, and not a lot of, not any legislation behind it or real detail. And a lot of this stuff they've been asking for feedback from that, but it's really hard to tell exactly how far along they are and where they are on certain issues. And they're meeting privately with their members, and they're trying to get some sort of committee consensus on what that looks like before they put out a draft. There's some very controversial items that were put out, things regarding interest deduction, a border adjustment tax, and they have members on very different places within the committee, let alone the rest of the Congress. But they are farther along. As far as the Senate goes, they pretty much were nowhere in the process until recently. But Senator Portman of Ohio, Senator Toomey, who I think you may be familiar with, is a very good friend of the industry, and with the Chairman Hatch and his staff, has started to put together a Senate tax plan. I think that Senator Portman said he wants to have that out around June. The administration obviously put out their plan, which lacked a lot of detail, and probably, frankly, at 15%, it's very, very difficult to get to. Some would say unrealistic. But they put that out a couple weeks ago. I think one of the issues with that is on some of these more controversial items that are in the House blueprint, the Republicans were looking for some sort of advice from Trump on where are you on interest deduction, where are you on expensing, where are you on the border adjustment tax. That didn't really happen. So I think that what you'll see is behind closed doors, the administration and Republicans, both the House and Senate, trying to start getting on the same page so that way when they roll this out, there is kind of a more collaborative tone to it. The other challenge they have is in order for tax reform to occur, they have to pass a budget resolution for 2018 that has what we call reconciliation instructions. It's the same procedure they used for healthcare, well, eventually we'll use in the Senate if they decide to vote on it, that allows them to get around that 60-vote threshold so they can pass it with 51 votes. I think that the Congressman mentioned this, that the only issue is if you use reconciliation, the tax bill will have a sunset after 10 years, the same sunset you saw for the Bush tax cuts in 01 and 03. And so that's something that's challenging because part of this whole exercise is they want to provide certainty in the tax code, and obviously having something sunset after 10 years is not really the certainty that businesses need, especially with all the transition rules they're going to have to put in place in order to get some of these things done and for the economy to pivot. So I think that they're definitely working on it. They definitely want to do it. It's an uphill battle. It's challenging. The congressman mentioned the last time they did tax reform was 1986. There's a reason why, because it's very, very difficult. But I think they're certainly trying to set forth on a pro-growth tax plan, and that's how they're going to spin it. That's how they're going to push it. So we'll see.
Yeah. Well, so I hope, there was no mention of financial products in the blueprint. There was no mention of it in the Trump administration's outline. So, I think the question I've gotten from some people is, how likely is it that there's going to be anything in this tax plan that deals with that? Why don't you talk about that from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to be categorical because they are having, rightfully, some really candid, confidential conversations. So no one has seen legislative text, and we won't for a very long time. But Congressman Reed has been pretty forthcoming about the idea of including a financial product proposal in the tax draft that they are working on. There are some discussions around what test might be used for the options, looking to regulations such as IRS 871M. And so I think that that's generally, that's unfair. It's met with both worry, but also some level of comfort that they're trying to hit the right mark and be consistent with other standards out there that people are generally comfortable with. Senator Wyden introduced his own ideas on the Senate side last week, and that included a financial product proposal. So I think it's safe to say, even though we haven't seen the text and won't for a while, that it's going to be part of the plan.
And with all the focus on border adjustment tax and some of these really big picture issues, talk a little bit about the challenge and the effort required to sort of keep this industry's message out there and heard during these debates. Do you want to start, or Jeff?
Sure. Well, I think this is something that well, it's challenging because just in the fact that we're a very complex industry, and the good news is that we're not just starting this process now. We started this years ago when Chairman Camp put out his draft, and we've been educating members on both sides of the aisle, for years now. And even when there was that kind of lull in tax reform, we kept going. And for anything, what we try to do is you try to build coalitions, and we have done that with the help of both OCC and the coalition as a whole. We have been explaining to these members why this is an issue. So then, when it's time, now we're talking to Congressman Reed's staff. We're not explaining them the issue. Now we're helping them draft legislation that's not going to be, is not going to hurt the industry. So we got to that point, and that has been, since 2012, we've been working on this.
Right. Well, and every step along the way is a new moment, right? Sort of things start over. Camp was introduced, then Wyden, and now a new version of Wyden, and whatever comes next, there's sort of a new starting point every time where you try to move that ball forward, and it does. I think one of the things that people sometimes don't realize is it's a very retail sort of business. It's very much individual meetings with individual members, individual staff. It's a very time and personal intense task that the industry has, and the DC reps are sort of out front on that a lot, but also when various industry people come to Washington and they build that into their agendas for their days, it's very important that that message continue to get delivered time and time again.
To be specific too, what we've had to do is in a larger vacuum of border adjustment, interest deduction, is that we've had to get a member that's going to say, I'm going to try to own this issue. And as you've turnover in Congress, sometimes you have to kind of get a new champion each Congress. But the good news is that some of the relationships we've been cultivating over the years are now people like Congressman Reed that are taking leadership roles in how this is going to come out. And it's the same thing with Senator Toomey on the Senate side. So we've been really trying to cultivate those guys. Now they're in positions of leadership that can help us as the process moves forward.
Okay, let's switch over to financial regulatory reform and the probability that some things happen there that are interesting. Now, the administration has said a lot about this. President Trump has issued several executive orders. The House Financial Services Committee has marked up the Choice Act. Imagine that will be going to the full House. The Senate, we're not sure is going to be too open to that. So, Lita, tell us a little bit about the different components and how they're moving forward.
Right. So obviously the Republicans have the White House, and they're also in control of both the House and Senate. So there definitely is unified agreement that changes do need to be made to Dodd-Frank. I think the rub is exactly what those changes might be. Julie mentioned President Trump has signed 3 executive orders, and they focus on core principles for financial regulations, orderly liquidation and Dodd-Frank, and the dealing with the too big to fail doctrine. None of these executive orders are policy, and the fact that they're printed doesn't make any changes in policy. What it does is their Secretary of Treasury is to present reports to President Trump on these 3 executive orders, and I think that starts next month. Yeah. As far as the House is concerned, they're actually way ahead of everybody. They, as Julie mentioned, the Choice Act was passed in the House Financial Services Committee last week. It was on partisan lines. It's expected to go to the floor as early as next week, I'm hearing. And there are included in the act, they deal with the orderly liquidation, and I think that the too big to fail doctrine is in it as well. The Senate, however, they haven't even begun to really look at Dodd-Frank. I don't think they've taken any public action on it, right? No hearings. So, I do think that once they do engage, I think the Senate Banking Committee could act pretty quickly on it because they already will have then the House bill and they have the White House recommendations. So I guess it depends on, how much progress will be made. It all depends on the strength of the Democratic opposition to it. So
Right.
hard to tell.
And one of the interesting things about the Choice Act, I think, in terms of capital, which we all know is sort of death by 1,000 cuts for many, is the Choice Act actually has this concept where firms could hold more capital in exchange for avoiding certain other regulatory requirements. Well, it's interesting. It does incorporate an aspect of choice. You can go down this path or that path, but what's been the reception to that, and how might different size, maybe you can talk to this, Hope, the large firms, small firms, is this a small firm play, or do you see much interest at all across the different size firms?
Well, before I answer that question,
Yeah.
I just wanted to follow on something Lita said. I completely agree. The Choice Act is, it's gone to the committee. It's going to make it out of the House. It's going to come over to the Senate, where it's largely believed it will be ignored with respect to the really partisan items that are in there. And so what is happening is you have a number of standalone pieces of legislation, some of which directly impact our industry, including the exchange-traded fund industry, that are moving both within the Choice Act and then separately. So once Choice comes over to the Senate, the initiative is going to be to sort of break apart the items and bucket them into definitely not, definitely yes, that's a very small bucket, and then the middle of,
Coffee mug.
and so I think that, to the extent that they can move those separate items, that could happen much sooner than a comprehensive regulatory reform package in the Senate, which I would put at best to be the first quarter of 2018. But you guys tell me if you disagree.
Can't disagree.
I can't. Can't disagree.
On the Choice Act itself, and the folks in this room, you contend with this every day, so please speak up if I'm mischaracterizing it. But my impression is that the leverage ratio of 10% that's provided in the Choice Act is so insurmountable to the large banks that they would probably be arguing more along the lines of a status quo as opposed to falling in favor of meeting the 10% threshold. I think the smaller firms, looking at just the banks, there's some regulatory relief in there for smaller banks, not necessarily the regionals, but definitely the community banks and some of the credit unions. So I think that it is largely more favorable to the smaller financial entities, the smaller banking entities. But on the whole, my impression is that the leverage ratio is very problematic from the perspective of increasing costs of clearing, affecting, because it requires the clearing member to, one, they have limitations on how much they can do because they have to meet the leverage ratio. And so that increases the cost of being a clearing member, and it impacts its relationships with other entities, because like options market makers in this room, because you can no longer provide, your liquidity is impacted with how much you can, how much your bank counterparty is willing to take.
Right. And
So I think on the whole, generally viewed as quite negative.
I would agree based on what I've heard. And we're running out of time, and I'm hoping to get some questions from the audience. But let me just ask one follow-up to that. So it seems like some of the capital issues then that folks in this industry and related industries are most focused on, relief may be more likely to come directly from regulators than from legislative action, do you think? Do you think that's a fair characterization?
Yeah, I mean, I think it could. On some of the requirements, it's going to take 5 prudential regulators plus the SEC, CFTC getting in line together. A lot of these were joint rulemakings under Dodd-Frank. So that's, we know how that would go. But yes, I think on the whole, I think a lot more is going to proceed administratively than legislatively, just given all the tensions with the Senate 60 vote and all the rest.
Okay, so our first question from the audience is, we have talked a lot about congressional procedures and process. as government relations professionals, what are the biggest challenges to representing the options industry on Capitol Hill?
Let me take that.
I'll give it.
I'll take
jump ball.
I'll take it. So, having represented the futures industry for a number of years before I joined CBOE, what I think one of the biggest challenges is explaining, it's obviously, and you know this, educating members of Congress about the whole big derivatives umbrella, and that it is a big umbrella and options is just this sliver of it, but that I think when you want to talk to a member of Congress, I don't think a lot of them are actually that familiar with how many people probably in their districts that use options in their portfolios. But having gone through this tax reform process, I've learned a lot about that, and I do think when you put it to them that way, they take much more of an interest in that. So, I mean, I know you guys do this too, but at CBOE, you know, we have a great options council when, besides going out every day with these guys and on our own and sort of educating them about sort of an options 101, they think they know it and they get excited about it, but you know, then they'll say, well, how about those commodities? You know, or what about this? So it's just constantly repeating the history of options and what they do for the public, the good they do for the public. What do you think?
I agree.
Yeah, I agree with that.
All right, well, we're done.
Okay, here's a brain teaser for you. What is your confidence in the border tax implementation? I think that means, I guess, do you think it's going to actually become the law of the land?
I don't. Do you?
I think that in its current form, there is it's a very difficult path forward. But I think that it affects so many businesses in such a significant way that just writing it off if it's not happening, I think would be foolish. But I think that there's some scenarios you could see a border tax light that maybe some industries can get behind. The problem is it's just where they need the revenue, and this is a huge source of revenue. So where does that revenue come from? It doesn't come from this. Some have said, the idea of paying for tax cuts is a new kind of phenomenon for Republicans. But if you're also going to pay for larger, have reform, tax cuts are one thing, but if you're going to have a whole rewrite of the tax code, you are going to have revenue, and it depends where that comes from. And what the speaker has said that I'm all open to hearing other suggestions, but until I hear them, it's still going to be what we're going to try to push forward. But I think that in the current form, it's very hard to see it happening.
Okay, the next question from the crowd says, we heard from Congressman Reed about the Problem Solvers Caucus. From a government relations perspective, how important is a congressional caucus in terms of getting legislation passed?
Very.
Very?
I think very, yes. Those are big blocks of votes. Like this, he mentioned the Problem Solvers Caucus now are like up to 40. You've got the Congressional Black Caucus, which is like 50-some votes. You've got the now Hispanic Caucus. You've got the Freedom Caucus.
Yeah.
I think, Jeff, you know more from the Hill, but.
And Lita, I think also, it seems to me, some of these caucuses vote together all the time. Some of them don't.
True.
And I would say even things like the Tuesday Morning Republicans, which is a more moderate, or the New Democrats. So those are caucuses of a sort, right? But they don't necessarily always vote together. But they could, certainly. And Jeff, you might have an experience where it's been very important.
I think that the source, when Tom talking about that, is that I think that's a good place for them to bounce off ideas. But leadership has so much control of these guys. They can come to consensus, and Nancy Pelosi could say to them, "There's no way that you can vote for this. You can't vote for this bill." But I think I think it's more of a good place to come up with ideas that say, here, Speaker Ryan is a way to get out of the box that you're in, that we could possibly moderate the bill and bring Democrats over, and here's a path forward. But as far as the day-to-day of counting votes and trying to get people over the finish line, that's going to play less of a role. But I think it's great that these members are talking, as he said. But the other caucuses, which Lita mentioned, they do tend to lock arms together. Very rarely does the Freedom Caucus not vote all together. You can pick off a couple of them. Very rarely does the CBC and Hispanic caucus not vote together. We just saw this with the healthcare bill with the Tuesday group, the moderate members. They voted more in a block for the longest time. I don't remember all of them locking arms like this. So I think it definitely does play a role. And it does strengthen numbers too. It's like anything else. If you can go to them, we're not going to, if 30 of us aren't going to vote for this, you don't have enough to pass it, you have to change it. So there's strength in numbers for sure.
Okay, we're almost out of time, but I like this last question, so we're gonna try to do it in a speed round. What advice would you give to people in this room who have an interest in engaging with the Hill, the SEC, and the CFTC? Is it worth their time? I'm going to go ahead and take the first. So I definitely think it's worth the time. I think there's an old saying in Washington: if you're not at the table, you're on it. And I think that you need to share your perspective. And I would say recently we had a great experience where, and this was driven by one of the executive orders that Lita talked about, in the Treasury Department in looking to put together this study on regulatory reform recommendations, is inviting all sorts of people from all sorts of industries in to talk about the regulatory structure that they deal with in their business and what their thoughts are on that. And if you don't bother to go, if you're not engaged enough to do that, and if you don't take those opportunities, then you'll never be heard. And I think particularly you would be amazed at what members of Congress, the time they will take and the interest in your business. If you're a constituent in particular, or if you're part of an industry that they're on a committee of oversight, they really do, in my experience, want to hear. And we're always knocking at the door, but I think there is strength in numbers, as Jeff said, in this regard as well. Anybody?
Nope, you said it.
I can touch on the administrative agency pieces of it. I mean, I think it's a the ecosystem for advocacy is deep and far and wide. And so I think it's important, not just to look at the Capitol Hill legislative aspects, but I understand that some people might think that it's not worth their time to go to the SEC or the CFTC because it takes so long and it feels like such an uphill battle. So I think people should think about the tactics to do it. You have many options. You can go through a trade association. You can go through outside counsel. You can go in yourself. And I think that a good strategy usually involves all three of those and probably other tactics. And so it's not just writing a comment letter, throwing it in the comment file, or going in for one meeting. If you really want to affect change, and again, it depends on what your measure of victory is, because victories at the agencies are often a lot less forthcoming than ones on Capitol Hill. I would just advise people to think about doing it in a kind of a multifaceted approach. But on the whole, I think it's worth the time.
And I think the pace of policy making is so much slower than the pace of business that can be discouraging at the outset. But you have to build in for that. As Jeff said earlier, the system of government we have was not designed for quick, swift things to happen. It's supposed to be deliberative, and as frustrating as that can be, that's the process we have. And so yes, get out there.
Yep.
Okay, we're over. It's blinking at me now.
All right.
So thank you, everybody, for your attention.
Thank you.
The preceding program was a production of the Options Insider Radio Network. For more quality options programs, visit www.theoptionsinsider.com or search for Options Insider Radio Network in your podcast provider of choice. Listeners can also access all of our programming through our mobile app, available in iTunes and on Google Play. Don't forget to follow along with your favorite programs and submit your own questions for the hosts at twitter.com/options, facebook.com/theoptionsinsider, or via questions@theoptionsinsider.com.